going to do today is uh, I'm going to talk for just a few moments about the idea of memory and how maybe to think about that in very simplified terms, and then we can sort of just like go through the handout and some of the sources there, uh, and uh, and yeah, and then we can just chat. And so basically, uh, the idea of historical memory is it's just simply how events are remembered, right? How an event from the past is remembered, and it's remembered not just by one person, but it's remembered by telling a story, right? You have to for an event to be remembered beyond one person, somebody has to tell the story, right? And in some sense, so one of the ways that I explained this to my sort of 8-year-old nephew was, you know, if if he came home from a soccer game and I asked him, how was the game, and he said, uh, I scored 2 goals, and I said, oh, that's great, um, but he didn't tell me that he scored 3 own goals and his team lost, right? So that's creating a memory, right? That's telling a story, and when you tell the story, you decide what you get to include and what you get to leave out, right? And what you include and versus what you leave out can be very different stories, right? Whether it's for a soccer game or for the Declaration of Independence, for that matter. So it really does. For me, it just boils down to storytelling, right? And uh, one of the ways that we see that, and I did this with a group of teachers back in the fall, when I did a sort of a talk slash tour of the Yale Art Gallery, was to look at portraits from the 18th century, and I'm going to share my screen here. So, so this is Hezekiah Beardsley, and this is a portrait that you can see in the Yale Art Gallery. It's actually part of a pair with him and his wife, and it's from like the 1780s. And Beardsley was a pediatrician, and people in the 18th century, it, it, it it was no small investment to have a portrait painted of yourself, right? And it's not like nowadays where, people take dozens of selfies every day, right? So you had to really, really want a portrait of yourself, and in some sense be well off because it was quite costly, right? But it, because it was such a rare occurrence for people in the 18th century, there's almost nothing in these old 18th century portraits that is accidental, right? Everything is intentional. If you had one chance to get yourself painted, right, everything is chosen with real care. And so, in the case of Hezekiah Beardsley, he's a professional, he's a doctor, um and he has books, he's showing that he is successful, right? He's showing that he is someone who is interested in learning, but also someone who's wealthy enough that they can own books in the 18th century, which is not the case for most people. It in the 18th century, in fact, in many of the portraits that have books, you can actually, if you get close up, you can read the titles of the books because they want you to know what they're reading. In this case, he's reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbons, which is a very famous, one of the most famous books of the late 18th century. But then, of course, if you look out the window, he is trying to communicate in his portrait that he is a landowner, right? That's his land outside the window. That's one of the main things that he's communicating through this portrait. And so it's a similar thing here. This is his wife, Elizabeth Beardsley. She has her own book, which is a religious book. Um, and her dog, who she obviously loved very much, right? And you can see outside the window behind her and what's important to her, right? What's important to her is religion from the book, her dog, and her garden, right? So these portraits were a way of communicating things about people. This is Isaac Smith. This is actually from the 1760s, and he was a Boston merchant um, who made his fortune basically selling wine, and you can see that he has this the rich color of his suit, this sort of purplish. In the 18th century, indigo is one of the most expensive dyes, right? And so, if people, wealthy people, to signal their wealth, they would wear, you know, blues, purples, colors like that. And because that was a real signifier of wealth at a time when most common people, they wore earth tone clothes, right? So he's really signaling his wealth with this suit, not just through the fanciness of the suit, but also just the color of it, right? In his wife's corresponding portrait, you can see uh, again, the land in the back, they are landowners. She's holding grapes, right? Because as a wine merchant, that's the source of the family's wealth. She's wearing a blue dress, right? And also a sort of almost sort of purplish, so similarly um, uh, uh, over shawl there. And so they use these portraits to express the things about themselves, to express what was important to them, and how they wanted to be perceived, right? And in some sense, people, we all do that nowadays, right? People curate their social media feeds, right? How they portray themselves online, whether it's on social media uh, or just generally. And I think it's an interesting exercise, because students sort of take so many pictures of themselves and pictures of the people around them, to think of an exercise in terms of like these portraits. If you could only ever have one picture of yourself, whether it was a painting or a photo, you know, what are the things that you would include in that photo or in that painting? What are the things that are most important to you? What are the things that you would most want to communicate about yourself? And when you do that, whether it's in a classroom exercise or on social media, in a sense, you're creating a public memory of yourself, right? You're creating a public memory of yourself for the sort of consumption of others. And in some sense, that's what John Trumbull's famous painting of the Declaration of Independence is effectively doing, right? He is depicting the Declaration of Independence, and by extension, the Revolution in a very specific way, right? This is probably Trumbull's most famous painting, certainly now. And if you look at this painting, and it's the main, it's probably the primary image, I would say, that most people think of when they think of the Revolution. Maybe the Emanuel Lewitz's famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, right? But in this, I mean, this tells a story about a revolution that is carried out by very elite men, right? Dressed in quite fancy ways. I have a source from the early 19th century when the sort of fashion styles had changed and men had stopped wearing stockings, and this sort of critic of Trumbull's painting called it a shin piece, right? So, but that didn't stop it from being hung in the U.S. Capitol. But it depicts a very sort of staid a very sort of stolid and even stoic revolution, right? There's no hint uh, of ordinary people, right? There's no hint of the violence that suffused the American Revolution. There's no sense of any kind of dissent, and so these are things that Trumbull chose to depict and also chose not to depict, right? First, by choosing this as one of the scenes of the revolution that he painted, but also in the way that he painted. And so, to to spread a historical memory is basically to tell a story. And I think that, especially nowadays in the days of social media, that students probably can understand that now better than previous generations of students in terms of understanding, the sort of importance of of conveying a public story about yourself, essentially. So I want to move to the handout, and let me see if I can share the handout here. Yeah. So I've included the obviously the Frederick Douglass July 5th speech. It is, to my mind, it's one of the most important documents when it comes to the memory of the revolution. I mean, I talked last week about the importance of the abolitionists in the memory of the revolution, and specifically the Declaration of Independence. And Douglass really is at the heart of that. And this speech of his from 1852 really gives voice, to the ways that the abolitionists were sort of re-envisioning the revolution and the Declaration of Independence, for that matter. And there's just a few passages I want to quickly just point out. There's this one that I've highlighted here, um, and I'm not gonna read it all, but he says, basically he points out that, um, that the position that the revolutionaries took in 1776 was not necessarily shared by the majority of the population, right? He says they had not adopted the fashionable idea of the day. Um, and and then he sort of, points out that, or in a sense analogizes the abolitionists, right, who were still who had garnered a significant amount of support in the previous 2 decades, but were by no means a sort of majority in the early 1850s. And so, he says, uh, it's sort of fashionable to dismiss the abolitionists as radicals, and but he points out that basically there was a time the when many people in 1776 thought that the founders themselves were plotters of mischief or agitators and rebels. Uh, and he says that to side with the right against the wrong, with the weak against the strong, and with the oppressed against the oppressor, here lies the merit, and the one which of all others seems unfashionable in our day. And he says, the cause of liberty may be stabbed by the men who glory in the deeds of your fathers. And this is where he makes that point that I talked about last week, which is that, it was a insult to the memory of the revolution to celebrate July 4th and talk about liberty while, not just while slavery existed, but if you were also at the same time not doing anything to more fully realize the ideals of the Declaration. And then, of course, he calls the Declaration famously the ring bolt to the chain of the nation's destiny. Um, and then he has this long passage here on the third page where he says, "I'm not wanting in respect for the fathers of the republic," and he calls the signers brave and great men and whatnot. And he goes on to say much more of that kind of thing. And and then in the middle of the speech is where it turns, and we get the most famous, I think, sort of passage uh, from the from the speech, which is, "What to the American slave is your Fourth of July?" And this is where he um, calls the shouts of liberty and equality a hollow mockery. Right. This is again this point that if you're celebrating the revolution, but you're not doing anything to more fully realize liberty and equality, then you are essentially insulting the memory of the revolution. And by extension, that means that to honor the revolution, to really honor the revolution, means to more fully work towards realizing those principles and that idea that I talked about last week of the unfinished resolution. Um, One of the things that I think students, when they read this nowadays, and not just students, some historians for that matter, tend to read those passages where Douglas is sort of praising the revolutionary generation and the Declaration as as him being insincere. uh, and I that that has never really struck me as well, as logical, really. There's Douglas by 1852 has been a public speaker for some years. He has and is well known among the community that he's speaking to. He has no reason to throw out meaningless platitudes or say things that he doesn't mean. I take him at his word here, but but part of the point of that is that he uses the first part of the speech to sort of build up, the importance of the revolution, of the Declaration, of the founding ideals, precisely so that in the middle, when in the whole middle section where he then turns and calls out all of the sort of hypocrisies that exist, um, that's it, it's the fact that he has already praised the Declaration, the Revolution, and all of that so heavily in the beginning, that makes that middle part have all that much more power to his audience, right? Because it is this sudden turn. It's not him going from being insincere to being sincere. Um, it's him setting up in a very logical and rhetorical way. Um, the critiques that he had to make. And in fact, at the end, the final section, he goes on to basically praise the Constitution. So I think, if you're teaching this document nowadays, it can be very easy for students to read Douglas as being insincere. But I think it's really worth sort of challenging that notion, because it's very easy for us to just project onto someone like Douglas, our own sort of modern, perspectives, right? Of course, I think it seems logical. Of course, abolitionists would think that the Declaration was hypocritical, just like we do, and so I think it's a really good opportunity to sort of challenge um, that tendency to sort of look at the past through the lens of the present. And then, the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls. And I think, one of the great things about this document is the list of the grievances, right? And, there's a lot to be said uh, for for allowing students to develop their own lists of grievances, whether it's having to do with their classroom or their school or just society generally. And this is a really, really good example of that. And it's also can be interesting to compare, the preambles of the Seneca Falls Declaration and the original Declaration. Then I've included the Declaration from 1876 that we had talked about, when Susan B. Anthony read at the Centennial event in Philadelphia. And then I just have a few resources here. There's a really good annotated Declaration of Independence at americainclass.org. A link to a very high resolution image of Trumbull's painting, and a link to this really interesting television show from 1953 that's on YouTube. It's quite worth a watch. It's like it's a show that Walter Cronkite hosted initially as a radio show in the late 40s, and then when he became a television person in the early 50s, he sort of created it as a television program, and it's like a news broadcast on July 4th, 1776, and so uh, it's 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 actually quite interesting because it has this one scene where they're doing these interviews in like a tavern outside Philadelphia, and and it offers up perspectives from loyalists, perspectives from some people, people who were pro-independence, and then also um, some men from the frontier who start talking about why they're going to fight for independence, and that I think there's a lot there's a lot worthy of discussion in that episode, and it's like 20 minutes or so. So there's also I also have a link to the famous scene in the John Adams miniseries where the Congress votes independence, and uh, and the best thing about it is that just as soon as the vote passes and it's calculated, and then it's they declared that the vote had passed, and they had voted for independence. There's just absolute silence and a sense of dread that falls over the room, and I think uh, it's a really interesting scene to watch for that reason. It's not a moment of jubilation, right? It is a uh, it's for many of them a moment of dread, but really a moment of uncertainty, right? Above all else. And then finally, I included this image of the Pennsylvania Gazette from July 10th, 1776, which prints the Declaration in full on the front page of the issue, and then but that is that is juxtaposed um, quite instructively with several ads for runaway slaves, right, in the right column, and that's a that can be an interesting juxtaposition to share with students, and to raise that issue of the relationship between slavery and the Declaration, and the ideas in the Declaration, but also slavery and the Revolution generally. So those are some of the resources that I put together, and I'm really interested just to hear some thoughts, and just to have a little conversation. Vicky.
I was just trying to unmute myself.
Yeah.
Um, the resources that the package that you provided for us is a very good one, and I think that getting the students involved as much as possible is important to maybe see how something that took place 250 years ago is still so relevant today. And being able to pull out some of the um, discrepancies, like you just mentioned on the Pennsylvania Gazette with the advertisements for the runaway slaves. But I like the idea of students coming up with a list of their own grievances, because that would open up a big discussion. And I think that's a very good use of getting them to understand how it was. you know, that people were doing the same sorts of things they'd be doing today, you know.
Yeah, I mean that's it goes back to what I talked about at the last week, which is really that it's just as important. I think the history of how the Declaration has been used and redefined really is over the last 250 years is really just as important to me. It's just as important to learn as the history of how the Declaration comes about, say in the spring and the summer of 1776. Because once you realize that generations uh, uh, of people uh, have redefined this document. They've redefined these words, right? Um, that 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 means that that the students themselves can do that. They
Yes.
can redefine those words. You decide what liberty means. That Jefferson doesn't decide what liberty means for you today, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
You decide. Even Douglas doesn't decide that for you. You decide what liberty means to you. What does equality mean to you, right? There's all kinds of equality, right? There's racial equality, there's economic equality, there's social equality, there's all kinds of equalities, right? What does that mean? What does equality mean? You know, and I think I think that this anniversary is a really good opportunity to to give some additional weight to conversations like that.
Hmm.
You
Well,
know,
and it helps them to have a whole different perspective about what history means, and that it isn't just something that happened 250 years ago. It still has importance for us today.
it is. It is. I mean, it is essentially what you make of it, right? I
Mhm.
mean, and there's a quote in the Douglas speech where he says, "We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future."
Mhm. Mhm.
Right? And I mean that's it in a nutshell, really.
Yes. Yes.
The past. I mean, people who learn about the past for the sake of it, just for the sake of it, they're not historians, they're antiquarians, right? That's what an antiquarian
True.
is, right?
True. True.
Um, a historian is someone who is looking at the past, but is inevitably, shaped by their own times, by their own context, and that affects, the questions that historians ask and where they look for answers to certain
Hmm.
questions, right?
Hmm.
Um, it always reminds me it always reminds me of this story. One of my undergraduate advisors was Carol Birkin, who was a sort of pioneering women's history, a historian of early women in early America, and in like the 70s and 80s. And she told me a story once about how she was at an archive with Pauline Mayer, who's a well-known political historian of the revolution in those same years. And she said that the two of them were at the same archive, and they were actually sitting across from one another, looking at the same collection of documents. And when they left to go to lunch together, you know. Um, uh, Pauline, who was looking, for political related stuff, was like, oh, I'm really disappointed in how little I found in that collection. And Carol was like, are you kidding me? Like, I'll tell you all the things that I found, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's you can look at the same things just from different perspectives, and so yeah, so that I think to just to empower these students, like I said last week,
Yes.
2026 is a civic opportunity, right? And I think we all probably agree that the way that our education system functions nowadays does not give enough weight to civic education, right?
No.
I mean, we've spent 30, 40 years folding, folding history and geography and civics together and calling it social studies, right? Like,
Mhm.
and devaluing each of those in the process, right? So, I think that this is a civic opportunity, this anniversary, and it prevents, an opportunity for civic education for students.
Yes, and I think that's very important, maybe more important now than it's ever been. So,
Yeah, yeah, I would absolutely agree. To define liberty, to define equality, to have conversations with each other about, the about those definitions, and where they can agree and where they don't agree. What does liberty mean? What does equality mean? What does tyranny mean? What is um, the Declaration says that if the government isn't doing what it's supposed to, you have the right to alter or abolish it.
mhm.
Now we don't talk about that part a lot because uh, we don't even Jefferson immediately after that says, but it's got to be for really serious things, basically,
Yeah.
because you really open a can of worms with that, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
There's like the
Mhm.
whole question there. Then what at what point is that kind of thing justified? And if it's not, and it doesn't have to be in the context of saying, abolishing a government or revolution, but it can just be about resistance.
Mhm.
Like at what point is resistance, or even to take it a step to lower it down a notch even more, protest, right? At what point are those kinds of things, justified? Uh, so yeah, so there's just I think that the conversations that you can have, you know, coming out of that, using the document as a framework and using this history to inspire students to have those conversations,
Yes.
it seems to me it's just a really exciting, you know, uh, possibility.
Yes. Yes.
Joanna, how is that? How does that translate to your work?
Yeah, the framing you provided last time was so helpful as you
Mhm.
historicize these commemorations over time and kind of encourage that lens of looking at various freedom struggles, especially groups that have pointed out how ideals from the Declaration haven't been realized.
Yeah.
I'm wondering with other revolutionary groups later who kind of maybe don't refer back to this document as much, but use their own rhetoric,
Mhm.
about power or
Yeah.
capitalism or
Yeah.
like community control, like who
Yeah.
find other terms in kind of modern
Yeah.
rhetoric. Do you see this as being part? If we use the Declaration as an anchor, as a starting point
Yeah.
for exploring various freedom movements and pointing out some of the hypocrisies or ideals not realized, how do you then find connections to others?
Yeah. I mean, you could. I mean, I didn't go that far in the book because I had more than I had more than enough to work with, um, just with direct references alone. But I mean, it people use terms like liberty and freedom sort of interchangeably. I mean, if you're using a term like that, whether you're referring directly to the Declaration of Independence or not, uh, you're there's a connotation there in a sense, right? Like that's it just from it's sort of saturation in our political culture. But I mean, also those those direct mentions popped up in places that I totally did not expect to find them. Like I mean, I knew about when coming into the book, I knew about like Martin Luther King, and how he had, at saying at the March on Washington, so I knew that he had talked about the Declaration, but like then I found this one graphic, and I'm trying to find it right now to show you, which is like exactly the kind of thing that I did not expect to find. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Oh, okay. So It's yeah, okay. So it's not the greatest resolution, but I'll show it to you anyway. Let me see. So if you see this image here, this is a flyer that was put out by the Black Panther Party in 1966, so early on, with their platform and their program. And that the bottom portion of the right column is a long quote from the Declaration of Independence with a machine gun under it. You know what I mean? So it popped up in places that I just totally did not expect. And that's that's an example of that. I think the one of the others that I was kind of surprised how much I found it in the sort of the early gay rights liberation movement, like the Mattachine Society and of course, it became more common during the bicentennial in the mid '70s because of the anniversary, right? But to see, like the Mattachine Society using that kind of rhetoric in 63, 64, so um, yeah, so I mean, it popped up in places, lots of places that I didn't expect, but the Declaration is so ubiquitous, right, in our in our political culture, even our popular culture. You know, uh, I mean, if you think of, I mean, just something like the National Treasure movies is an example of that, right? Like just the popular culture, the weight that the Declaration has in popular culture. That it's hard to talk about, you know, uh, equality or inequality or liberty or freedom or unfreedom for that matter. Any of those terms and not have the Declaration be somewhere in the sort of ether, you know. Yeah. Vicky, what are your plans?
What are my plans in what respect?
Are you currently teaching?
I am not.
Uh,
I am a retired social studies, high school social studies teacher
so
who took this because of personal interest. And I also thought I still have friends who are teaching,
mhm.
and I thought I might be able to share some ideas with them and encourage them in some ways that I would find valuable. And so that's why I'm here.
So how
And
did you
I'm a member of Connecticut Council for Social Studies.
how, did you teach the Declaration?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Well, how much time did you give that? And
Oh,
and how would you describe your approach to teaching that?
um, I guess I concentrated a lot on the importance of the document at the time
Hmm.
and how it rallied people to support the cause more than I really spent a lot of time talking about well, I mean, ideas might have popped up in later years of
Yeah.
history, but I didn't at that point, make any future references.
Yeah.
The one thing I have to say is that unfortunately, as time went on, we were expected to do more and more in the same amount or even less time than we had before.
Yeah.
And so it was very difficult. It was
Yeah.
very difficult.
I mean, that's a whole other aspect of it is is to just be able to carve out the time, right, to do any of this kind of thing, within the context of uh within the curricular context and within the sort of uh, context of administrative pressure or whatnot, that all of that kind of thing. So I'm totally not surprised to hear that. And it is the case. I mean, it's not. I mean, I think that's how the Declaration was taught. When I was in high school, when I was in college, it was focused on the document itself. like focused on, um, say that, let's say, the history and immediate impact of the document, but so like all, but also in college it was sort of more like, oh well, these were the intellectual sources of the Declaration, right? Like
Mhm.
John Locke's social contract, right?
Yeah.
Natural law, right? Uh, uh, the Scottish Enlightenment, that those kinds of things. And I mean, that's interesting, to people like me, but as like an intellectual historian.
Mhm.
But what is the real utility
No,
of
true.
that, right? I mean, uh, I don't see how, how learning about that kind of stuff for a contemporary student really has any, can have any sort of, meaningful impact. It almost seems more, I mean, I hate to say it, almost seems more trivial than anything, especially given, you know, how little, not just students, but most people read nowadays,
True,
right?
true,
That
true.
that's its own
Yes,
challenge,
yes,
right?
right, right. No, what you encouraged us to do with the declaration, to talk about how it's come down through history and still been a relevant document and can be applied today and appreciated today, I think is much more valuable at this point
Yeah.
than something like that. I totally understand how from an intellectual point of view, that's interesting. But for the average student, they're probably not going there.
I mean, you could say, I mean, there's some people might say, oh, well, that, that's a shame. It's just a reality, that we have to deal with. And I encountered the same thing, when I was teaching undergraduates, say at Knox
Mhm.
College, the level of historical background that they came in to college classes with was, um, was, I suspect, fairly lower than, say, a generation before,
Mhm.
and the amount of reading that they did outside of school, seems like it's declined significantly in the last 20 years or so. And so, like, almost really any teaching the Declaration in a way that relies on, you know, extended reading of old texts. You know what I mean? Like that just
Mhm.
is not. I mean, as much as students should be able to do that, it just does not seem the most economical or practical
No,
way to approach the
no,
topic nowadays,
no, no.
right? Or any
And
topic.
and because you have limited time and you really want to grip them and have them understand and appreciate, yeah, I agree. I think you have to go another route.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So, all right. So, I have really enjoyed talking about this and talking about this with you this week, especially. But so I hope that some of what we talked about over like the last week or two uh will be useful if you find an opportunity to pass it on.
Yes.
And this is the kind of case like that I've been making at when I've been speaking at like 250 related events and things like that. Is a very similar case. And in fact, I'm working on a very short book about the Declaration that's sort of very much in that same sort of vein. For me, as a historian of memory, I always think that you know that there's real value, not just for historians, but for anyone, for understanding how the past has been used, and how the different ways that we tell the stories about the past, and how that changes their meaning, changes how we understand them. I think that there's real value in understanding that kind of thing, just for anyone. But yeah, especially especially over the next year or so. You know, there's going to be lots of opportunities, not just for debates over these, ideals or ideas of the Declaration, but there's going to be probably, unfortunately, uh, lots of our opportunities for those discussions brought about by current events.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, to be ready to take advantage of those moments, I think can be really useful, whether it's some kind of whole unit or something that somebody would teach about the Declaration, or if it's just to be prepared for those moments, if you're not, uh, because I think, you could kind of introduce this idea of the meanings of and the definitions of these terms changing over time. You could introduce that idea quite quickly, right?
Mhm.
And in a way that doesn't require reading long passages from Douglas necessarily, or it can. I think it's pretty, you know pretty comprehensible, just
Mhm.
from people understand that the meaning of words change, but people think of the Declaration as this document that's locked behind in a bulletproof case, at the National Archives, that gets lowered down into a vault at night. Um, it's like it's almost this sort of permanent, unchanging thing, but of course that's not the case, and so uh, yeah. So I think that whether you focus specifically on the Declaration or not for any amount of time, that the idea alone could be introduced very quickly if you're not teaching something on that topic, but current events end up, sort of inspiring conversations about those ideas. Right.
Mhm.
So,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yep.
All
And
right.
I think the students appreciate the opportunity to express their opinions
Yeah.
and I think it's incumbent upon us to once again reintroduce the idea that civic discussion or civil, I should say
Yeah.
civil
Yeah.
discussion is the way to go. I mean, that's so important to our society.
Yeah.
And
It is
it's a skill that people have lost,
yeah.
you know.
It is a real opportunity for, to be able to have those kinds of conversations in a civil way, right?
Yes, yes,
In a
yes,
way where people feel free to, feel free to disagree, right?
yes, yes,
There's nothing
yes.
wrong with disagreeing with one another.
No.
Um, and so yeah, there's lots of opportunities that are provided by this moment, but also just by thinking about the past in this way. And I'm on a sort of one-man mission here over the next year or so to convince as many people as I can of that, and hopefully that'll help some more students have some kind of meaningful experience
Yes,
around this anniversary and this really important civic opportunity.
yes, yes. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for coming, Vicky. I really
Okay.
appreciate it. Joanna too, of course.
Thank you very much
Yeah,
for
and
doing this. It was
no,
great.
it was fun for me, and I hope that it was useful for everyone.
Yes, yes, it was. Absolutely.
Great.